In this video, we're going to be looking at the rules, triggers, and expression builder components within the AppForms designer. So you'll see here I've opened up a form that I've already pre-laid out some controls that we'll be using for this particular demo. In this form, I've got two text boxes, text number 1 and text number 2. Label with an equal sign and another label that has a default value of 0 and will be utilized to display the results of the calculations based on the numbers in text box or text number 1 and text number 2. So there's several different ways that you go about adding a rule within AppForms Designer. What we'll do here is we're going to take a look at the different ways or several different ways that you can go about doing that. So the first way is, so let's say we want to add a rule to the plus button such that whenever this button gets clicked, the rule will take the value in text number 1 and add it to the value in text number 2 and then display the result in the LBL result labeled here to the right. So one way you can do that is if you'll notice here on the left-hand side of the designer, there is a rules panel. So we'll click on that. And there's an option here to create a new rule. You'll set the rule name by clicking the edit button here. There's a delete button to delete the rule. And then there are 3 items that are listed below the rule: trigger, actions, and decisions. A rule is basically consists of one or more of these objects. There can be multiple triggers, and basically a trigger is something that will cause the rule to execute. In AppForms, the rules are event-driven, and by that I mean something has to occur to cause that rule to execute, and that something is referred to as a trigger. That can be anything from, for a button, would be the user clicking on the button. For a text box, user entering a value or changing the value within the text box. For a combo box, it would be selecting a different item or selecting an item from the combo box. Those are the things that would trigger an event to occur. So in this particular case, when you select the combo box and we add a rule, we'll call that rule, add rule. That's going to associate the trigger being the name of the control itself, which in this case is btn add. That is your trigger for this particular rule. Now, underneath trigger, you've got 2 other objects. You've got actions and decisions. Actions are basically what they imply. It's an action. It's something that you want to occur when that rule gets executed. A rule can consist of 1 or more actions, and a rule can also consist of 1 or more decisions. And a decision is basically just that. It's a conditional statement that you're going to set up to determine what code path do I want to take. For example, you may add a decision that says if txt number 1 dot value is 5, then I want to do something specific. That would be a decision. When you go and you create the decision, you're going to have basically, it's an if then else type of evaluation. So you'll have a true part and you'll have a false part. If the evaluation returns true, it's going to go down one path. If it returns false, then it'll fall down and execute down the other path. So for this particular case, for the plus operation, we're not going to bother with setting up a decision here. We just want to do a specific action, and that action is to take the value of txt number 1, add it to the value of txt number 2, and set that value to the LBL result label. So we'll click the add action, and that's going to give us an item here that we'll click into, and that will launch the expression builder. And the expression builder is used within AppForms to aid you in creating your syntax for your action or for your decision that you're creating. You'll notice here on the left, there's a list of items, anything from controls to forms to functions, operators, etc. In this particular case, we're going to look solely at the controls item because that's what we want to affect with this particular action. So if you click on controls, you'll notice that it'll provide you with a list of controls that are available on the current form. Now, you may think of this action as basically kind of like an equation. And this equation is going to be, when we add this value, these two values together, we want to set the value of the label. So there's going to be three components to this equation. There's going to be the left-hand side, which is denoted by this box. This box is going to be, for our purpose, is going to be an operator to utilize the equal operator. And the right-hand side is going to contain the calculation that we want to perform. So the first thing we'll do is we'll select the LBL result field or control. And then you'll get a list of properties that are available for that control in the far right column. So we want to select value. And when you do that, you then click the add button, and that will add that syntax to the left-hand side. So now we have the LBL result.value portion of our function created. So what we want to do with that is we want to set it equal to something. So we'll select the equal operator. And that will place it into this expression component. And then the last thing we want to do is establish our calculation. And that's going to be txt number 1 dot value. We add that. And then we want to click the plus operator. And then we want to add it to txt number 2 dot value. And then we'll click add. So this is our syntax for our action. We want to set LBL results.value equal to the value of txt number 1 plus the value of txt number 2. Once you get this established for your syntax established, you can click the verify button. You'll get a green outline indicating that the syntax is valid, and then you can click done. And at this point, you've now added your rule that would occur whenever the click button or the plus button is checked. So let's take a look at that. So we'll click preview. Enter a value of 20 into the first field, 5 into the second field. I click plus, we get the correct calculation of 25. Now, let's take a look at what it would look like to add a decision. So in this case, we'll utilize the divide button. And what we want to do here is, because we know that if we try to divide txt number 1 by a value of 0, we're going to get an error. So what we want to do here is try to handle that scenario. So what we need to initially do is select the BT and divide button, click create new rule. We'll give it a name of divide rule. Notice that the trigger is set to the BT and divide button. In this case, we want to go down to the decisions item and click add decision. Now, as I mentioned before, decisions will comprise a true component and a false component. So the first part will indicate the true component. And so what we want to do here is click into that component. And what we're wanting to do here is to create an evaluation. And that evaluation is whether or not the value in txt number 2 is 0. And so what we'll do, again, is we'll click controls. In this case, we'll click txt number 2. And we'll select value. We'll add that to our left-hand side. In this case, we don't have the operator over here for this to click on it to add it. So what we'll do is just manually type it in. And this is going to be an exclamation and an equal sign. And basically what that indicates is not equal. And for the other side of the equation, we'll type in the number 0. So we want this condition to be the value in txt number 2 is not equal to 0. So once that's entered, we'll click done. That adds that to the condition about, or to the definition of that condition. And now we need to add an action. So we click the plus here. This will insert an action underneath that code path. If the value is not 0, then we want to proceed as we normally would and simply set the value of the LBL result label to the value of txt number 1 divided by the value of txt number 2. So again, as we did before, controls LBL result.value. We want to set that equal to txt number 1.value divided by txt number 2.value. Click verify, click done. So that handles the case when it's not 0. So what happens when it is 0? So in this case, because it's a true and false component, we know that we've already established the true piece. So we don't really need to set up any criteria for the false. So you simply just need to add an action for the false condition. And to do that, we click the plus associated with the false condition and then click within the action to launch the expression builder. And in this case, what I want to do is again set LBL results value. I want to set it equal to, but in this case, I just want to return a string that says calculation error. We'll do that. We'll click done. Let's save the form, preview it. So if I enter a value of 20 into the first field and 5 into the second, when I click divide, I'll get the correct answer of 4. Now, if I change the value in the second field to 0, this is going to trigger, should cause us to trigger down the false path. And when I click divide, I'll get the calculation error log. So that using the rules panel is one option to be able to add a rule. Let me show you another option. So what you can do, let's say we want to use the clear button here to just clear out the results, or the result in the label, and also clear out the values in the txt number 1 and number 2 field. So another way that we can create a rule is to, you'll see up here above the panel is a rule button. So if you click the rule button, this is going to take you to another view of rules. And from within this window, you can easily manage and see all of the rules that have been generated for the report, or for the form rather. It shows you a listing here of the rules. It shows you the attached trigger. And as before, the trigger is simply what is going to cause that rule to execute. So you can see for the subtract rule that I previously set up, we've got it associated with the click of the btn subtract button. There is a list of triggers below, which is going to list you all of your controls that are on the form. There's also a default list of triggers, which are things like form load and unload and spell check, etc. Those can be added. And to add them, you simply just need to locate the control you want to associate with that rule, and then just click this up arrow tick item, and it will add it to this attached triggers listing. There are rule variables that you can create, and we'll take a look at those a little bit more in a bit later. And then lastly, up above, you have some buttons. This will allow you, the create rule will allow you to create a new rule. Create variable will allow you to create a new variable. And then the help button, let's take a look at that real quick. If you click that, it's going to launch a help dialog. And by default, it's going to give you a list of all of the functions that are available within AppForms. It's an alphabetical listing. You can search that function list. So for example, if I wanted to look up message box, I can search that. It'll pull up the message box function, give me a list, an indication of the syntax, the arguments that it takes, etc. If you don't know the exact name of the function and you just know something like, say I want to, for example, look up something to do with a substring to try to find that, then you'll get a little information, fetch the substring, which sounds like what I'm looking for. You click that, it'll bring up the function name again with the argument listing and some additional information about the function. So for what we want to do here, we want to create a rule that's going to get executed by the clear button. So let's click create rule. We'll title this or name this clear rule. We'll add an action, and notice when you right click you have several options: add action, add a decision, create a variable, and then you can also copy paste, delete, or disable the item. So in this case we're going to use the clear function, and we're going to pass it the two text box controls so that it will clear those. And then we also want to reset the LBL result LBL result label value to 0. So let me show you one additional thing. You notice here to the right of the action item is a FN button. If you click that, this will also launch the expression builder as we saw before. And again, you can utilize it to aid in creating and establishing the syntax for your action. So we'll just set the result value to 0. And so that then sets up the clear rule. Now, there is one caveat that many times I miss and then wonder why the button doesn't work. When you go this route to create the rule, you'll want to make sure, if you want to execute this from the button click and you want to associate that button to this rule, you'll need to make sure that you associate the trigger for that control, because right now, if you notice, clear rule has no triggers associated with it. So if I were to go into preview, and actually let's just take a look at that. If I go into preview and I put some values here, if I click clear, nothing happens. And that's because we haven't associated the rule or associated the trigger with the rule. So let me locate btn clear. I've got the rule selected. I locate clear, click the uptick item. Now it's added to that trigger. If I now try that action again and click clear, notice it clears out and resets. So that's yet another way that you can go and set up a rule. And lastly, let's take a look at a third way that you can do that, and that is to simply say, okay, for the multiply button, I want to create a rule and set the actions to handle the multiplication component. So a third way you can do that is if you click on the button, you'll get the little properties pop-up window. If you click the rules and attributes, there is a create rule item here that you can utilize to create a rule for this button. And when you create the rule in this manner, it's going to automatically set up and associate the trigger for this control. So we'll create rule. By default, it's going to give you a name of on underscore the control name. If you want to change this to multiply rule, you can do that. Again, for this, we're just going to utilize the IntelliSense here, which, as you'll notice, is going to provide you with some indication of the fields and controls that are available, as well as their properties. Sorry, multiply. So now if we preview this, we get a value of 20. So one thing I wanted to go back and mention, I know we talked about variables a little bit, so let me try to cover that in a little bit more detail. So variables are containers that you can use to populate, and they persist within the scope of the form that you're working with. And so you can utilize them in cases where maybe you need to store something that's not readily available in a control, or just persist some value to be used later on as a calculation. So what we're going to do here is simply utilize a couple of variables to just give you an idea of how you might use them to, in this case, we're going to use them to handle the add calculation, which you wouldn't necessarily, and obviously don't necessarily need to do that, but I just want to demonstrate a way that they could be used. So we want to click create variable. We'll call the variable number 1, and we'll create a number 2 variable. So once you create them, they'll show up under this list of rule variables down here. What I'm going to do to utilize them is I'm going to select the txt number 1 field. I'm going to create a rule, and in the action, I'm just going to set the variable 1's value to txt number 1 dot value, and I'll do the same thing for the txt number 2 control. Okay, so we've set our 2 variables, so when the user goes in and modifies the values here, that will change or update the value stored within our variables. So let's add another button, and we'll call this btn add variables. So on click of that button, we're going to set the label result to v number 1 plus v number 2. And there we have the value of 10. So those variables can be useful. Now, in this particular case, they're not as useful as other scenarios, but there are definitely scenarios when you're working with forms that you may need to have a variable there just to store the value to be used later on for some sort of calculation or maybe some evaluation purpose. So the last thing I want to cover is dealing with subrules. And so let's go to our divide rule again. Let me show you this. So as I mentioned before, when you right click on the rule, you have an option to add an action or a decision, and you can add multiple actions and multiple decisions. But what happens if you wanted to, let's say you wanted to nest some sort of conditional logic. So for example, I want to make this evaluation to see whether text box 2 or text number 2 has got a value that's not 0. And then maybe I wanted to then check to see if that value was between 1 and 5 or some range of numbers. I can't, if I click add decision below, that's going to add a decision at the same level that this current decision is at. I can't add a nested decision this way. So what I need to do in order to be able to do that is I need to go in and actually underneath each of these condition statements, you can add a new rule to that. And then this rule will then have the option to add nested decisions underneath it. So this can be useful, obviously, again, if you're dealing with, multiple levels of nested type conditions or looping scenarios. Can be utilized for something like that as well. But in this particular case, I don't want to necessarily create nested conditions, but what I want to show you is another use of subrules, and that is that you can use them to simplify your code or your rules such that you don't have to recreate, you don't have to always recreate things. You can reuse something that's already been defined somewhere. So in this case, what I've done is underneath the else statement. So in this case, this would evaluate and execute when txt number had a value that was 0 during the division operation. So what I've done is I've underneath the else statement here, I've created a rule called calculation error, and I just moved the setting of the LBL result value to the calculation error string here. Now, fundamentally, that doesn't change anything with regard to the divide operation. So let me show you that. If I divide by 0, I still get a calculation error. But where this might be useful is, let's say I want to go to my multiply rule and I want to change it, and I want to add an action or a decision here to say only execute the multiplication if the values within the two text box controls are not null. So what you might do in this case is you'll set up your condition, and that's going to be, I'm going to use the isNull function for that. So I want the condition to be isNull of text box 1 is false. And we're going to do a combination. So we also want to execute this only when both text number 1 and text number 2 have values. So in this case, we can use the AND keyword. And what that will do is evaluate both of these text boxes, and the condition will be considered true only if both text number 1 and text number 2 are not blank or null. If either one of them are, then it would fall under the else condition. So if they're not null, then I want to then move the calculation, the multiplication operation there. If either one of them are null, then what I want to do under the else part of the statement is I want to utilize the run rule function. And when you do that, it's going to take an argument of a rule name that you want it to execute. So you'll notice that here are all the rules that I currently have defined in the form. And under the divide rule, I have this subrule called calculation error. So what I want to do is, if either of them are null, I want to set the result value to be calculation error. So I could easily just simply set this here, but because using an action as I did in the divide rule, but because I already have it defined, I can simply just refer to the subrule that's already defined and call it. So let's take a look at how this would work. So if I have 5 and 5 as my two values and I do the multiplication, I get 25. If, however, I clear out the value of txt number 2 and I do the multiplication, then I get the calculation error. So that's very helpful, again, in scenarios where maybe that subrule was not just simply setting a single action. It might be a whole series of actions, or it may contain a group of conditions that need to be evaluated, and it might be cumbersome then to try to recreate that time after time. You can just simply utilize the run rule and the subrule that you've already defined to be able to call and reuse that rule. I hope that you found this video beneficial. Please view our other AppForms training videos for more in-depth tutorials regarding AppForms, as well as our how-to videos that show you how to implement various tasks within your AppForms solutions. Thank you.